All right, welcome back. This is the final chapter in part 5. It is chapter 27, and the name of it is Pieces of Eight. And something to note, when you see the title, you see that it's got quotation marks around it. The titles of these chapters have not had quotation marks around them generally, so you have to understand that maybe something is saying, or someone is saying Pieces of Eight, and that's interesting. So you can think about what that might be, right? Okay. So as we just left Jim in the chapter prior to this, he had just killed a man. He had killed Israel Hands in self-defense when Israel tried to kill him when they were beaching the ship, the Hispaniola, in the north inlet of Treasure Island. Now, Jim is the whole reason that the boat is there, because he went and he cut the anchor line in the night. Israel Hands and his buddy O'Brien were drunk and fighting. Okay, and so Jim miraculously ends up back on the Hispaniola with them, and only Israel Hands is alive, but he's injured. And here we are. This is between Israel Hands and Jim. They got the boat into North Inlet, and now the boat is at the beach, and Jim is alone with the events that just occurred. Okay, here we are. Owing to the cant of the vessel, slant cant, the masts hung far out over the water, and from my perch on the cross trees, I had nothing below me but the surface of the bay. Hands, who was not so far up, was in consequence nearer to the ship, and fell between me and the bulwarks. He rose once to the surface in a lather of foam and blood, and then sank again for good. As the water settled, I could see him lying huddled together in the clean, bright sand in the shadow of the vessel's sides. A fish or two whipped past his body. Sometimes by the quivering of the water, he appeared to move a little, as if he were trying to rise. But he was dead enough, for all that, being both shot and drowned, and was food for fish in the very place where he had designed my slaughter. I was no sooner certain of this than I began to feel sick, faint, and terrified. The hot blood was running over my back and chest. The dirk, where it had pinned my shoulder to the mast, seemed to burn like a hot iron. Yet it was not so much these real sufferings that distressed me, for these, it seemed to me, I could bear without a murmur. It was the horror I had upon my mind of falling from the cross trees into that still green water beside the body of the cozen. I clung with both hands till my nails ached, and I shut my eyes as if to cover up the peril. Gradually my mind came back again, my pulses quieted down to a more natural time, and I was once more in possession of myself. It was my first thought to pluck forth the dirk, but either it stuck too hard or my nerve failed me, and I desisted with a violent shudder. Oddly enough, that very shudder did the business. The knife, in fact, had come the nearest in the world to missing me altogether. It held me by a mere pinch of skin, and this the shudder tore away. The blood ran down the faster, to be sure, but I was my own master again, and only tacked the mask by my coat and shirt. Okay. So it must have just clipped him in the meat of his shoulder, and it didn't actually get him any place important, but it was stuck into the mask really hard and he couldn't pull it out. But when, he moved, his skin ripped, and though he's bleeding a lot, it's not serious. Okay. These last, his shirt and coat, he broke through without a sudden, these last I broke through with a sudden jerk, and then regained the deck by the starboard shrouds. For nothing in the world would I have again ventured, shaken as I was, upon the overhanging port shrouds from which Israel had so lately fallen. I went below and did what I could for my wound. It pained me a good deal, and still bled freely, but it was neither deep nor dangerous, nor did it greatly gall me when I used my arm. Then I looked around me, and as the ship was now, in a sense, my own, I began to think of clearing it from its last passenger, the dead man, O'Brien. He had pitched, as I have said, against the bulwarks, where he lay like some horrible, ungainly sort of puppet. Life-size, indeed, but how different from life's color or life's comeliness. In that position, I could easily have my way with him, and as the habit of tragical adventures had worn off almost all my terror for the dead, I took him by the waist as if he had been a sack of bran, and with one good heave, tumbled him overboard. He went in, and with a sounding plunge, the red cap came off and remained floating on the surface, and as soon as the splash subsided, I could see him and Israel lying side by side, both wavering with the tremulous movement of the water. O'Brien, though still quite a young man, was very bald. There he lay, with that bald head across the knees of the man who had killed him, and the quick fishes steering to and fro over both. I really think that that paragraph is a kind of a sad one for Jim, because he realizes that he doesn't want to be on the boat with a dead guy. And the dead guy's kind of in an easy place, because when the boat went like this and he rolled down to like the rail, he's up against the bulwarks, look that up. And so he is able to go down there and just kind of heave him over as easily. And here's the thing, he's like, the events that he's been through have made it so he's not as bothered by dead bodies anymore. I mean, he didn't want it on the boat, but he could go down there and just throw him over. And then he's kind of bothered by the vision that he sees down there of the two dead bodies in the water. Yeah. I was now alone upon the ship. The tide had just turned. The sun was within so few degrees of setting that already the shadow of the pines upon the western shore began to reach right across the anchorage and fall in patterns on the deck. The evening breeze had sprung up, and though it was well warded off by the hill with the two peaks upon the east, the cordage had begun to sing a little softly to itself, and the idle sails to rattle to and fro. I began to see a danger to the ship. The jibs I speedily doused and brought tumbling to the deck, but the mainsail was a harder matter. Okay, so he sees that the wind is picking up, and so if all the sails are there, that it might get bounced around because the wind will pick up in the sails. So he's like, I have to put them down, but it's kind of hard for one kid to do. Of course, when the schooner canted over, the boom had swung outboard, and the cap of it and a foot or two of sail hung even underwater. I thought this made it still more dangerous, yet the strain was so heavy that I half feared to meddle. At last, I got my knife and cut the halyards. The peak dropped instantly. A great belly of loose canvas floated broad upon the water, and since, pull as I liked, I could not budge the downhaul. And that was the extent of what I could accomplish. For the rest, the Hispaniola must trust to luck, like myself. So he ended up just having to cut the lines to the sail, and the sail would be really heavy and it's in the water. He just had to leave it like that and just hope for the best. I mean, he saved the boat, cut it loose away from the pirates, and saved it again. By this time, the whole anchorage had fallen into shadow. The last rays, I remember, falling through a glade of the wood and shining bright as jewels on the flowery mantle of the wreck. It began to be chill. The tide was rapidly fleeting seaward, the schooner settling more and more on her beam ends. So sun is setting, it's getting colder. I scrambled forward and looked over. It seemed shallow enough, and holding the cut hawser, it's the anchor rope, remember, and both hands for last security, I let myself drop softly overboard. The water scarcely reached my waist. The sand was firm and covered with ripple marks, and I waded ashore in great spirits, leaving the Hispaniola on her side, with her mainsail trailing wide upon the surface of the bay. About the same time, the sun went fairly down, and the breeze whistled low in the dusk among the tossing pines. At least and at last I was off the sea, nor had I returned thence empty-handed. There lay the schooner, clear at last from buccaneers, and ready for our own men to board and get to sea again. I had nothing nearer my fancy than to get home to the stockade and boast of my achievements. Possibly I might be blamed a bit for my truantry, but the recapture of the Hispaniola was a clenching answer, and I hoped that even Captain Smollett would confess I had not lost my time. So thinking, and in famous spirits, I began to set my face homeward for the blockhouse and my companions. I remembered that the most easterly of the rivers, which drain into Captain Kidd's anchorage, ran from the two-peaked hill upon my left, and I bent my course in that direction, that I might pass the stream while it was small. The wood was pretty open, and keeping along the lower spurs, I had soon turned the corner of that hill, and not long after, waded to the mid-calf across the watercourse. This brought me near to where I encountered Ben Gunn, the maroon, and I walked more circumspectly, keeping an eye on every side. The dusk had come nigh hand completely, and as I opened out the cleft between the two peaks, I became aware of a wavering glow against the sky, where, as I judged, the man of the island was cooking his supper before a roaring fire. And yet I wondered in my heart that he should show himself so careless. For if I could see this radiance, might it not reach the eyes of Silver himself, where he camped upon the shore among the marshes? Okay, so he's making his way through the dark, and he remembers it's a good thing he memorized that map, right? So he remembers, and he's following ways, and he goes back along where he met Ben Gunn, and he sees a big bonfire. And that does kind of seem strange. They would see a big bonfire because Ben shouldn't be trying to advertise where he is, because he could get attacked by the pirates, right? Gradually, the night fell blacker. It was all I could do to guide myself even roughly towards my destination. The double hill behind me and the spyglass on my right hand loomed faint and fainter. The stars were few and pale, and in the low ground where I wandered, I kept tripping among bushes and rolling into sandy pits. Suddenly, a kind of brightness fell about me. I looked up. A pale glimmer of moonbeams had alighted on the summit of the spyglass, and soon after I saw something broad and silvery moving low down behind the trees, and knew the moon had risen. So he's getting moonlight now, so he can see where he's going. With this to help me, I passed rapidly over what remained to me of my journey, and sometimes walking, sometimes running, impatiently drew near to the stockade. Yet, as I began to thread the grove that lies before it, I was not so thoughtless, but that I slacked my pace and went a trifle warily. It would have been a poor end of my adventures to get shot down by my own party on mistake. The moon was climbing higher and higher. Its light began to fall here and there in masses through the more open districts of the wood, and right in front of me, a glow of a different color appeared among the trees. It was red and hot, and now and again it was a little darkened, as it were, the embers of a bonfire smoldering. So he's getting close, and you can see there was a bonfire smoldering, just the coals. For the life of me, I could not think what it might be. At last I came right down upon the borders of the clearing. The western end was already steeped in moonshine. The rest and the blockhouse itself still lay in a black shadow checkered with silvery streaks of light. On the other side of the house, an immense fire had burned itself into clear embers and shed a steady red reverberation, contrasted strongly with the mellow paleness of the moon. There was not a soul stirring, nor sound beside the noises of the breeze. I stopped, with much wonder in my heart, and perhaps a little terror also. It had not been our way to build great fires. We were, indeed, by the captain's orders, somewhat niggardly of firewood, and I began to fear that something had gone wrong while I was absent. I stole round by the eastern end, keeping close in shadow, and at a convenient place where the darkness was thickest, crossed the palisade. To make assurance surer, I got upon my hands and knees and crawled, without a sound, towards the corner of the house. As I drew nearer, my heart was suddenly and greatly lightened. It is not a pleasant noise in itself, and I have often complained of it at other times, but just then it was like music to hear my friends snoring together, so loud and peaceful in their sleep. The sea cry of the watch, that beautiful all's well, never fell more reassuringly on my ear. So it doesn't look right. He gets a little scared. He kind of sneaks up just because he's not sure what's going on, but then he hears everybody peacefully snoring, and he feels a lot better. In the meantime, there was no doubt of one thing. They kept an infamous bad watch. If it had been Silver and his lads that were now creeping in on them, not a soul would have seen daybreak. That was what it was, thought I, to have the captain wounded. And again, I blamed myself sharply for leaving him in that danger with so few to mount guard. But by this time I got to the door and stood up. All was dark within, so that I could distinguish nothing by the eye. As for sounds, there was the steady drone of the snorers and a small occasional noise, a flickering or pecking that I could in no way account for. With my arms before me, I walked steadily in. I should lie down in my own place, I thought with a silent chuckle, and enjoy their faces when they found me in the morning. My foot struck something, yielding. It was a sleeper's leg, and he turned and groaned, but without waking. And then, all of a sudden, a shrill voice broke forth out of the darkness. Pieces of 8! 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 And so forth, without pause or change, like the clacking of a tiny mill. Silver's green parrot, Captain Flint. It was she whom I heard pecking at a piece of bark. It was she, keeping better watch than any human being, who thus announced my arrival with her wearisome refrain. I had no time left to me to recover. At the sharp, clipping tone of the parrot, the sleepers awoke and sprang up, and with a mighty oath, the voice of Silver cried, "Who goes?" I turned to run, struck violently against one person, recoiled, and ran full into the arms of a second, who for his part closed upon and held me tight. "Bring a torch, Dick," said Silver, when my capture was thus assured. And one of the men left the log house and presently returned with a lighted brand torch. Okay. So if you're Jim and you make your way through the dark, carefully back to the place where you expect to find your friends, and you sneak in and you find that instead of your friends, it's your enemies, where your friend should be, I think he's having a bad moment. So we're just going to let him hang there for a minute. You make sure that you filled out your summary, what happened in this chapter. Kind of a bit. It rambles. It has to get him from like the death of Israel Hands all the way back to the stockade where he is now. So write down your summary, write down your wonderings, write down the things that were difficult. It's not an easy chapter, so please don't try to pull that one over me. I know better. The three people, well, I mean, you've got those bodies to deal with. You could use the Hispaniola if you want to as a character. You could definitely at the end use Silver the parrot. Okay. Make sure it's filled out. The more notes you have, the better it will be as a tool for when you do your assessment. Okay. All right. I hope that all made sense. If you need more clarification, you can always join me on our Zoom meetings at 10:30 on Tuesdays. Okay. Hope to see you soon.